So Dr. Anne Winsper, congratulations on your PhD. I think it's the first time I've been able to congratulate you since I saw you last year at Seriously Strange.
Thank you very much.
Anne has had an interest in the paranormal since she was a small child, had a number of experiences that led to the question, what might be causing these phenomena? We're going to talk about time slips. That's the theory and some of the experiences that Anne has investigated herself. Anne has been a ghost hunter for many years, initially joining a local organised group. Disappointed with the non-scientific and fraudulent way the local ghost hunting groups were carrying out their investigations, she co-created Parascience with Steve Parsons, with the intention of applying scientific methodology to the field of ghost hunting. While Steve mainly concentrated on the equipment side of investigating, Anne pursued the psychological side, looking at how both witnesses and ghost hunters reacted to and reported apparent anomalous phenomena. To assist with this work, Anne initially gained a degree in applied psychology from Liverpool John Moores University and has now obtained a PhD in psychology from the University of Central Lancashire, looking at the phenomenon of electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, and has written many articles for various media and has also appeared in television productions discussing various areas of the paranormal. She's a regular speaker, particularly at our conferences, on the paranormal and anomalous phenomena. So Anne's going to talk to you about time slips.
Okay, right. The first complicated bit is sharing the screen. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. Big tick. Right, time slips. This is a phenomenon that I've got a bit of an interest in because we seem to have a bit of a local hotspot with lots of reports. So I'm going to go through some of the reports that I've received. I can't really come to any conclusions, but I'll make some comments as we go along about what people are reporting. So, oh, now I can't move slides. There we go. So I call them time slips. Some people call them retrocognition. I don't like the term retrocognition because it implies some form of extrasensory perception where knowledge of a past event's obtained. And some of the cases I've looked at, they don't strictly meet that definition, either because the events that have been perceived can't be verified or because they don't appear to be accurate depictions of past events. There are also recorded experiences that I think come under the heading of time slips, one of which I've personally investigated, where there's been no apparent shift in the scene perceived by any of the participants. However, one participant was apparently observed to move behind a building and almost simultaneously reappear at the opposite corner of the building, a feat which it has since proved impossible to replicate. So a quick reminder, the most famous case of an apparent time slip is the Moberly-Jourdain time slip in the gardens at Versailles. For those of you who may be a bit unfamiliar with this, I'll do some quotes from Ironmonger's book. Miss Moberly and her friend Miss Jourdain had been over to the Palace of Versailles for the first time as sightseers that afternoon in 1901. They were on their way to have a look at the Petit Trianon. They'd vaguely heard of it as the little retreat which Louis XVI had presented to his queen, the ill-fated Marie Antoinette. On the way, the two visitors between them saw 8 separate people in all and spoke with some of them. 2 gardeners, as they called them, in long greyish-green coats and small 3-cornered hats, a red-faced running gentleman in buckled shoes, anxious to divert them from their course, a woman and a girl in a cottage doorway, an insolent footman, a haughty lady in unusual old-fashioned clothes, apparently sketching trees, and perhaps the most impressive of all to them both at the time, a dark-faced, pock-marked man wrapped in a heavy black cloak and wearing a large hat, the very figure of a stage villain. The man's face, wrote Miss Moberly, was most repulsive, its expression odious. I said to Miss Jourdain, which is our way? But thought, nothing will induce me to go to the left, which is past him. And Miss Jourdain, too, was overcome with alarm and the feeling of being in the presence of something evil. It was some time before the two realised, so they said, that they'd spoken to people who no longer existed, and walked in a garden which had long disappeared. For the gardens in Versailles in 1901 were very different from the ones that they'd been walking in. There's been much debate over the years concerning the veracity of these reports, but I'm not going to go into details of this case because we could spend the whole evening just discussing this one case, and I still don't think we'd reach any conclusions. However, there's some elements of the case that I think are particularly significant, notably the following, taken from the first edition of An Adventure. From the moment we left the lane, an extraordinary depression had come over me, which, in spite of every effort to shake off, steadily deepened. There seemed to be absolutely no reason for it. I was not at all tired and was becoming more interested in my surroundings. Everything suddenly looked unnatural and therefore unpleasant. Even the trees behind the building seemed to have become flat and lifeless, like a wood worked in tapestry. There were no effects of light and shade, and no wind stirred the trees. It was all intensely still. Well, personally, I'd only ever read the story of this apparent time slip as a curiosity, but then we started to get reports of contemporary time slips, reported both to parascience and to others. I'll present some of those cases that were reported directly to us. There are similarities between the cases, but there's also individualities which create something of a puzzle. So the first reports I became aware of were clustered around the centre of Liverpool, particularly the Bold Street area of town. Bold Street itself used to be known as the Bond Street of the North and was originally laid out in the 1770s. There are apparently some secret passages underneath the pavement, and the Lyceum building on the left in these pictures was built in 1880 as the first gentleman's subscription library in England. The area's got a very rich history. Sadly, I've spent many, many hours of my life on that street and never actually seen a time slip myself. Sorry, you'll have to excuse me drinking. I did the most enormous sneeze with hay fever before, and I think I burst a blood vessel in my throat, which was quite spectacular. Okay, so this is the first case. This is a chap called Jamie. Obviously, I've changed the names. And he was walking one day in the early 1980s down Renshaw Street. Then he turned by Rapid into a little lane that takes you over the railway line and emerges by what used to be the Bureau Bar. He'd worked in Liverpool for some time and he knew the shops very well, noticing the ones that are closed down, such as Collinson's. There's an advertising flyer there. And the shop had left empty shoe stands and hat stands still in the window. Jamie carried on walking. He was going to meet his wife in town that Saturday afternoon. But as he walked onto Bold Street, he noticed that Collinson's appeared to have reopened, as the window was full of shoes and hats, as it had been a while previously. He also noticed that Catchpole's, a model shop, appeared to be on the other side of the street, where it had been some years before, prior to moving to a new site on the other side of the street. He turned to go down Bold Street and noticed that all the cars appeared to be 10 to 15 years out of date, but they all appeared to be brand new cars. He then noticed that all the shoppers seemed to be wearing unusual clothes, not dramatically old, but fashions from 10 or 15 years previously. He assumed that there was some event on in the city that weekend. But the street also seemed unusually quiet. There were sounds, but they appeared quite muted. Jamie carried on and met his wife outside the bank on Hanover Street. They went in and attended to their business. Everything in the bank seemed normal. But when they emerged, Jamie was surprised to notice that everything had returned to how he expected it to be. The empty shops were again empty, and Catchpole's was back to where it had been the previous week. Jamie is unsure if the scene changed back to normal as he and his wife entered the bank or as they emerged from the bank. But as the bank appeared normal, we assume that things changed back as he entered the bank. His wife, who hadn't been on Bold Street, hadn't noticed anything different at all that day. Okay, this is the next case. I like this one because there's some very unusual things that happened in it. So I'll read from the lady's statement. In 1996, my friend had recently finished school and got a job in a solicitor's office on Castle Street, opposite the town hall in Liverpool. Me and another friend decided we'd go and meet her from work. Having never been any further than the top of Lord Street, we joked that we'd probably never find it, as neither of us had been to Castle Street before, and we stopped to ask a lady for directions. She pointed us in the right direction, and we followed her instructions to walk past Boodles and turn right. The sky went dark and it started to rain. Huddled under our brolly, we started walking and turned onto Castle Street. I do not remember passing the Law Courts or the Victoria Monument, but we passed a series of roads instead with buildings that had slate-type roofs. As we walked up Castle Street, there was no traffic, just the odd black car. I didn't take much notice of the type, but both of us presumed it was a pedestrian-only road due to the cobbles. We joked to each other about how all the businessmen were wearing long black coats and bowler hats. Some of them had umbrellas and others had canes. We knew this area was the business district, but with neither of us ever having been there, we didn't think it strange. I remember walking past a gentleman in a bowler hat who looked at me very strange, and I joked to my friend that I did not realise people still dressed like this. After walking up Castle Street, we finally came to the end, looked up at the town hall, and all of a sudden traffic started coming up the road from behind us. We looked around and saw we were standing in front of the solicitor's office where we were going to meet our other friend. We then continued down Dale Street to catch the bus. Neither of us thought anything else of it until we told our friend how we thought it was very strange that city gentlemen still wore bowler hats and carried canes. She looked at us both with a bewildered look and said, "It's 1996, of course they don't." Okay, this is the next one, again in the main area of Liverpool, but not quite on Bold Street. This is a Mr. Jones, and he was 17 years old at the time of this incident, which took place in November 1971. At the time, he worked in the Liver building, and he used to get the bus to Birkenhead, then the Underground to James Street. Looking at the alleyway that the lifts exit from, the right-hand side passageway was blocked off. The lift was totally full at 8:30 a.m. This always used to be our favourite station as teenagers because you could get the lift up and sneak out of a back alley without having to pay for the train, but they cottoned onto that and you can't do that now. So Mr. Jones turned right out of the lift onto James Street. He was on his own and he suddenly realised it wasn't 1971. The people on the street were wearing old-fashioned clothes. There was a paved road and cars. It looked to him more like 1949 or 1950. On one side of the road up the hill, there were reddish-coloured buildings instead of the grey ones he was used to seeing. Mr. Jones describes being very scared. He turned around but could no longer see the station and cannot remember being able to see the alleyway. After a couple of moments, he backed up, terrified, and then turned around and quickly walked towards what he described as something. He cannot remember what was there. It might have been an alleyway, but such was his fear at the time that he cannot remember, despite trying hard. He entered a dark place, but recalls that the alley is dark, so it could have been the alley. Everything then went light, and he found himself back in normal time, back behind the station. Mr. Jones could only mention the incident to his family a few years later and has not told anyone else since until he heard us on the radio, when after he'd heard about other people's experiences, he decided to phone and tell someone about the experience. Back onto Bold Street. Chap called Sean, he had a lady friend who was very much a sceptic concerning matters of the paranormal. In the 1980s, she worked in Liverpool city centre, and if the weather was pleasant, she'd sit outside and eat her lunchtime sandwiches. This particular day, because it was sunny and warm, as opposed to that photograph, I'm sorry, but every time I've gone with a camera, it's rained in Liverpool, but this day was sunny and warm, so she decided to sit on a bench which was situated diagonally opposite Waterstone's bookshop in Bold Street. As she sat down, she noticed that the sun did not seem as bright as it had been moments before. In fact, looking back in later years, she described the light as similar to when the area had a partial solar eclipse. She also noticed that the street didn't seem as busy as it had been, which struck her as unusual for the time of day, 12:30 p.m. being the height of the lunch hour. She sat down next to a very smartly dressed man who was already sitting on the bench and started to unwrap her sandwiches. The gentleman engaged her in conversation and they chatted about inconsequential matters as strangers do. As they chatted, the thought crossed her mind that although smart and very amiable, the man next to her appeared to be dressed in an out-of-date fashion, reminiscent of the fashions popular in the 1950s. As they were chatting, the man asked her a question, and as she replied, she leaned forward to put her sandwich wrapper in the waste paper bin to the side of the bench. She took her eyes off the man for a split second as she dropped the wrapper in the bin, but carried on replying to his question. On sitting up again, she was astonished to realise that the man had completely vanished. She immediately scanned the area for him, but he was nowhere in sight and couldn't have run off in the split second that she'd taken her eyes off him. At the same instant, the sun returned to its ordinary brightness and the area was crowded with people once more. This is another one. If you look at the picture on the right, you can just see at the top the remains of St Luke's Church, which suffered major damage in the May Blitz of Liverpool during World War II. We always call it the bombed out church. So one evening, a chap called Sid was in the city centre. It was December and he'd been to the hi-fi shop, which was situated at the top of Bold Street. He was now on his way to meet a friend for a drink before going home. The weather was cold and the streets were icy. Sid made his way to Casey Street up at the top of Bold Street, then turned down the side of the church. As he passed the church, he looked up and was surprised to see that all the lights were on inside the church. He thought how unusual it was, as the church was derelict, not even having a roof. Occasionally there was a light shining in the porch, but nothing more. Sid was amazed, but assumed that the church had been renovated since he'd last been past it. A couple of weeks before Christmas, Sid was again passing St Luke's. However, this time he noticed that the church was again in blackness and was derelict and locked. Now, nowadays, the church is used for art events and artisan craft fairs and all sorts, so there is a possibility that you would see things there, but in those days it was completely derelict and the only people who ever went in there were the drug addicts and alcoholics and the homeless who used to sleep there. Right, this one is slightly outside of Liverpool, but it's just over the water in Thingwall on the Wirral. So this is a lady, Mrs. Price, and she'd recently moved to Thingwall. Her daughter was about 4.5, and she'd taken a bit of a poorly turn. As it was a fine sunny day, Mrs. Price decided to take her for a walk in the pushchair to give her some fresh air, and also to have a look at the area which she didn't know very well. She went up Mill Road opposite the primary school, and the lane she walked down was tarmacked, but the surface soon gave way to cobbles. As she walked along, she noticed a cottage on the right-hand side, with an old chap leaning on the gate smoking a pipe. He wore a collarless shirt and had his sleeves rolled up. Mrs. Price nodded to acknowledge him, and he nodded back. After this cottage, there was a row of whitewashed cottages with hanging baskets outside. On the left side of the lane, there was a circle of country house flowers, nasturtiums and other cottage flowers. To one side of the circle of flowers, there was a heap of sandstone, and behind this, there was a row of cottages. Alongside these, there was a stable block with an archway, and further on, there were more cottages, some built of stone and some built of cheap-looking brick. As Mrs. Price walked along, she saw a lady dressed like Mary Ellen, with a high-neck blouse, shawl, and black long skirt. She didn't appear to notice Mrs. Price as she was hurrying into her house. As Mrs. Price passed the house, she could feel the warmth from the fire in the range inside. At the end of the lane was a 5-bar gate, and a little girl was sitting on it. At the time, the programme Little House on the Prairie was popular on the television, and Mrs. Price thought how the child was dressed in a similar fashion, as was popular with some children at the time. However, Mrs. Price noticed that as well as a dress and pinafore, the child was wearing button boots. She thought this was odd, as modern children never went as far as wearing old-fashioned items like this. The little girl gave her a funny look, then jumped off the gate and ran into a cottage. Mrs. Price walked up to the 5-bar gate, behind which was a grassy slope leading to a meadow. She decided that as this was the end of the lane, she'd turn round and take her daughter back home. As she walked back down the lane, the man leaning on his gate was still there, and they both acknowledged each other again with a nod. Mrs. Price went home and described to her mother how she found the old part of Thingwall and how pretty it was. A couple of months later, the opportunity arose for Mrs. Price to take her mother to see the cottages. However, when they arrived, the path was no longer cobbles, it was all tarmac and paving slabs. The cottage where the man had been leaning on the 5-bar gate was now boarded up and almost derelict. The stone cottages had gone, replaced by 2 semi-detached houses. The circle of flowers and the stable block had also vanished. At the end of the lane, the 5-bar gate no longer existed, and down the dip was now an estate of bungalows. Mrs. Price remarked that whilst houses were built quickly nowadays, there was no way the entire area could have changed so dramatically in just a couple of months. About 8 years later, Mrs. Price was involved in a dispute about a footpath. Her solicitor suggested that she should obtain the 1830 tithe map of the area and check the footpath on that. After some difficulty due to the lack of dwellings on the map, Mrs. Price located first Woodchurch Church and then Thingwall Village. Mrs. Price was surprised to find that the buildings on the map exactly matched the buildings she'd seen the day she was taking her daughter for a walk. The pile of rubble she'd noticed was actually the remains of Thingwall Mill, which had been destroyed in a hurricane. Okay, the next case, we're moving south a bit. This one's in Southampton. Again, I'll read out the lady's statement. It was 1970. My mother and I would often go for a walk together on a decent sunny day around Southampton. At the time, we lived with my father and one of my sisters, the other being married, in a maisonette in an area called Golden Grove in the St Mary's area of the city. We went for a stroll to chat and relax and walked into St Mary's Street, by St Mary's Church, and crossed the road by the old Chantry Hall and headed more into the centre of the city. We ended up walking by the old hotel and turning right into Queen's Terrace, a row of 18th century houses which we used as offices and which faced a park which looked onto the many entrances of the docks. As we rounded the corner, I tried to imagine what this street would have been like in the 18th century, and in my mind had the vision of a man dressed in one of those black top hat styled hats which narrowed at the top, a black knee-length coat which was open, black waistcoat, frilly shirt, trousers just below the knee, those tight-like socks they used to wear, and black shoes with buckles. Whilst I was amusing myself with this notion, we could clearly hear the sound of music as we rounded the corner. We looked up, and on the second floor, the window was open. We could clearly hear the sound of a harpsichord being played extremely skillfully, and could even see the man's head, he had his back to the window, bobbing as he played in time with the music. There were very heavy-looking curtains tied back to either side of the window. He had greying hair tied back with a ribbon, and I could see the top part of a wonderful jacket. It was embroidered with lots of different birds in different colours. We were so fascinated that we listened for some time, failing to notice the total lack of traffic or any other noise. "He's very good, isn't he?" my mother said, and I agreed. "Indeed he is, Mum," I replied, "but we ought to get on." So we continued our walk, the sound of his playing fading as we made distance, but still failing to notice the utter lack of any other noise, and we turned the corner. After a while, we decided to end our walk and go back the same way we'd come. As we came into Queen's Terrace, we were hoping to hear the man play and walked down to where the house was. We looked up and were quite shocked to see the window in question completely boarded up. I looked at my mother and she at me, for it was only 5 minutes since we'd gone by. We discussed this afterwards once home, because even if you had half a dozen men to do the work, we would have heard them hammering and banging as they put the boards into place, but we heard nothing. We were astounded and were afterwards convinced that we'd experienced a time slip and stepped back 300 years or so to hear a marvellous musician play. What is also interesting is that particular house, still used as offices, never seems to hold any rentings for long, and I've often wondered why. So a lot of the cases go back 30, 40, 50 years. However, this is definitely a contemporary experience. This particular one actually happened 10 years ago now, but it's still relatively recent. And it happened about 6:30 in the evening in Birkenhead Park on the Wirral. So again, just over the Mersey from Liverpool. So Birkenhead Park is a public park in the centre of Birkenhead. You can see on the map the lines across the Mersey, which are the Mersey Tunnel. So the area we were looking at in Bold Street is just off the map on the right-hand side. So Birkenhead Park was designed by Joseph Paxton and opened on the 5th of April, 1847. One of its claims to fame is that the American landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted used Birkenhead Park as a template for his design of New York Central Park. The park is a Grade 1 listed landscape. Miss Bailey, the lady who had the experience, was walking in the park with a friend. They crossed over a hill in the park to the Birkenhead Cricket Pavilion when a lady in a long black dress with a white apron appeared. She was pushing a Victorian perambulator. Miss Bailey specifically noted that it was large-wheeled and very deep. The woman turned and looked at Miss Bailey and her friend. Miss Bailey describes how everything sort of went quiet and the birds stopped singing. A policeman then appeared, again dressed in what appeared to be a Victorian uniform, complete with a silver whistle. Miss Bailey thought at first that it must be some sort of amateur dress rehearsal for a theatre company, until she looked at the path. The path was originally tarmac, and now it appeared to be made of small pebbles. When she looked up again, everything that had appeared had simply vanished, and the scene was back to normal. Miss Bailey and her mother checked all the local papers and the internet to make sure there was no theatrical production being held. Although they didn't find any, they've still not totally discounted this theory, but they cannot explain the appearance of the path, which seemed to change in front of Miss Bailey's eyes from small pebbles and stone back into tarmac. This case is slightly different to the others as it happened when it was dark, so some of the more unusual features reported in other cases, such as the dimming of light and unusual quietness, weren't quite as noticeable in this case. This is another one in Bold Street, and this was a chap called Frank, and him and his wife split up to buy things from different shops. Carol, his wife, went to Dillon's bookshop, which then became Waterstones, which you can see here, and Frank went to one of the local record stores. The small 1950s box van crossed in front of Frank, honking its horn in his progress. The van's livery stated that it was from Kaplan's. He looked down to his feet and realised he was stood in the middle of the road. Frank crossed the road and saw that Dillon's bookstore now had a Crips signage over its entrances, and moreover the shop was selling women's handbags and shoes rather than books. Looking round the street, Frank realised that the people he could see were dressed in fashions from the 1940s. But strangely, a young woman in her 20s walked past him with a popular brand named handbag, and this reassured him that he was partially in 1996 at least. He smiled at the girl as she walked past and entered Crips. As he followed her into the store, the interior of the building changed in a flash to that of Dillon's bookshop in 1996. Frank questioned the young woman who'd entered with him into Crips, and she confirmed that she too thought the shop was a clothes shop rather than a bookshop. And of course, as I've said, Dillon's became Waterstones, which is the same site where the lady saw the vanishing man on the bench. Now, this particular story that I've just told you wasn't told directly to me, but I've included it because it's in exactly the same area as a lot of the cases that were reported to me. And there's a spooky picture of me many, many, many years ago outside Waterstones, desperately looking for a time slip, but all I found was a photographer who'd managed to come up with some sort of amateur effects on his photographs. But there you go. Sadly, it's not even Waterstones anymore. It's all closed down. So this is opposite Waterstones. So if you were standing at Waterstones entrance and looking on the other side of the road, this is what you'd be looking at. So the next tale that was told to me A chap said when he was about 20 years old, he was making his way through Liverpool to see his girlfriend. And he says, I needed to catch a train from Central Station, which, as you may know, is right in the area of Bold Street. So as usual, I walked down the large ramp that led from Bold Street, which you can see here on the left, into the station and towards the entrance at the far end. Casually glancing around, I wasn't really paying much attention. I was a man on a mission. My lady was waiting. I shot a look to the right and registered something odd straight away. My pace slowed, though I kept walking. There on the right was a cafe or coffee shop. It had sprung up out of nowhere. At the time, I thought it was odd, as my girlfriend and I often went to places round there, and only the other day had walked down the same ramp, and that cafe was definitely not there then, and neither had anyone been working on any such shop either. To make the situation even stranger, everyone in the shop and the few that were sat outside were all dressed in very old clothes. I'm guessing now, looking back on it, around the 1900s. The women that I saw were wearing large hats and looked very out of place. My first thoughts were, is something being filmed? And maybe it was a special day the cafe was doing and everyone was getting dressed up. So I just put down my lack of noticing it there before as being one of down to age and not really paying attention. I glanced ahead to make sure I wasn't going to walk into someone, and when I immediately looked back, the cafe was gone. At the time, I just put it down to me being weird, but it was only recently that I heard about Timeslips and made the connection, and it bugs me to this day that I didn't just walk over to the cafe and talk to the people there. However, I was really freaked out, and whilst others have said I'd ask someone to look me up, I can assure you that the actual event is so disconcerting that you don't think along those lines. The first emotion you experience is fear and an overriding sense that something is very wrong. Now that one does intrigue me because, as you can see, there is actually a cafe there now, but it didn't used to be a cafe, it used to be the post room. So he seems to have experienced some sort of forward time slip seeing a cafe, but then he describes all the people being there as being dressed in more Victorian clothes, so that's an unusual one. Another chap came out of this same path coming out onto Bold Street, and he said, I put my foot on the road to head across to Waterstones, and in a split second the scene changed and a hansom cab went past me heading towards the cathedrals, followed by lots of people in what I can only describe as being like the people on the Quality Street tins. I'm hopeless at history, so I don't have a clue what era they were. It was the hats I noticed most as I tried to take in what I was seeing. The ladies wore bonnets with brims, and the gents wore top hats and dark suits. Several couples walked straight past me as if they didn't see me. I immediately thought I must have walked into a film set, but there were no cameras about. And anyway, I couldn't have, because when I stood on the pavement, everyone was in the present time. Yet as soon as I stepped onto the road, everything went into a different dimension. At first I was confused and scared, and then just really scared as I thought about what would have happened to me had I been unable to step back into the present time again. And I have got some other reports from that same area of people seeing deceased relatives walking past, and it is definitely a strange area. Well, this one's slightly outside of town, but not too far out of town. And this is a chap called John. This is an old historical case, but John's father was a tram conductor. And one winter's day in December 1938, the weather was snowing a blizzard. He was working on the number 13 or 14 tram. I'm afraid I couldn't get a photo of one of those. I could only get the number 44, but it's close enough and it's in the right place. And it's going from Norris Green to the East Lancs Road. When the tram reached a stop at Strawberry Road, a man wearing a double-breasted lounge suit but no hat despite the weather put his arm out and held the tram. It was by now quite late in the evening and there were no other passengers on the tram. The driver opened the tram door and the passenger went and sat 3 or 4 seats down the car. John's father asked the man where he was going. Just down by the Napier, was the reply. That'll be 4pence then. The man paid with 4 shiny new pennies and took his ticket. John's father went and carried on talking to the driver as they continued their route. There were no more stops as no one else was venturing out in the terrible weather. As the tram approached the Napier, John's father turned round to tell his passenger they were nearly at his stop. There was no one on the tram, apart from John's father and the driver. They both checked the rear door, which was shut and had been shut for the whole journey. On the seat where the passenger had been was his fourpenny ticket. John's father decided to put the ticket back in his clip. After all, why not make 4p from the episode? The tram continued on to the Cherry Tree terminus, where they usually stop for 10 minutes before continuing. However, the weather was so bad, they turned around and continued straight back on their route. When they got back to the depot, John's father went to retrieve the 4 pennies, but couldn't find them anywhere, despite checking all the money and also his pockets. As he thought about it, he recalled that the pennies had not only been brand new, but bore the head of Edward VIII, whereas the current monarch was, of course, George VI. Also, the suit the man had been wearing looked brand new and was of the type used as a demob suit during the 1914-18 war. John's father assumed afterwards that the mysterious passenger had in fact been a soldier who'd been demobbed during the First World War, who had subsequently died before then appearing on the tram. Of course, we can't discount the possibility that this was in fact a time slip. So, these stories throw up some interesting questions. Were these all actually slips in time? Did the people involved somehow travel through time and see the world as it was 20, 40, 100 years ago? There are some similarities in the cases, for instance, muted sounds, fear, dimming of the lights, a lack of people. However, not all the cases show all or indeed any of these effects, so they can't be regarded as typical of an apparent time slip case. The gentleman who saw the shops on Bold Street as they had been 20 years before could conceivably have been having an experience that recalled the street as he already had it in his memory, rather than anything paranormal. Where facts can be checked, they don't always stand up to verification. For instance, in the Thingwall time slip, the lady describes how the scene she saw exactly matched the 1830 tithe map, yet she also describes a pile of rubble identified as the remains of Thingwall Mill. However, the mill wasn't demolished until 1900, putting the date at least 70 years later. And how do these cases differ from haunting cases? We could conceivably describe a haunting case as a time slip if we assume we're seeing the events of a previous age. The main difference in the cases I've looked at seems to be the scale. I would suggest that perhaps time slips and apparitional experiences lie on a continuum. In a time slip, the whole surroundings appear to shift, whereas in an apparitional experience, only one element appears to be anomalous, whether this is human, animal, or object. Mackenzie suggests that a retrocognitive event becomes a haunting when it occurs more than once, but again, this presupposes that the event is a true retrocognitive event, accurate in detail, and as we've seen, there can be anomalous features in these time slip cases. It may initially appear to make sense that the experience is a hallucination, as they seem to be fairly localised to one or two people. People report having these time slip experiences, whilst people alongside them report nothing unusual at all. And even in the Mobley-Jourdain case, there are differences in the reports of the two ladies. This would initially suggest that perhaps the experiences are indeed hallucinatory. Some of the scenery described by participants doesn't stand up to scrutiny, for example, the ruins of the windmill and the discrepancies in the stories of the ladies at Versailles. One of the experiences reported to me was of a street scene that the recipient had actually seen 20 years before, so perhaps we could also explain that away as a hallucination. It can also be it can also be argued that the conditions described by the witnesses, i.e. a dimming of the light, a muting of the sound, feeling terrified, could possibly be symptoms of a derealisation. None of the people involved, however, have described suffering from anxiety, but it wouldn't preclude a one-off attack. Maybe all the experiences really are purely hallucinatory and there's nothing paranormal about them at all. But that would still leave the question, why are so many people having these experiences and what causes them to happen in clusters in the same area? In some cases, however, like the Thingwall case, we've got the situation where some of the scene described doesn't seem to fit in with the known history of the location, but other elements fit perfectly and cannot have been previously known by the percipient. So maybe there is some substance in theories of telepathy or an imprint on a location. However, this still doesn't solve our problem. The solutions suggested don't describe how the telepathy might actually work or how there might be an imprint left on the place. So I'm going to move on to another case that we can't adequately explain by hallucination, telepathy or imprints. So this is a different variety of time slip, one that does actually seem to involve time itself rather than a change in scenery. So there were 3 participants in this case. I'll just call them S, D and H for now. And H was a child of approximately 10 years old. The location was known to the participants and to myself. It's a Norman church with a reputation for haunting. Also, we've actually had some unusual experiences there in the past, more related to haunting experiences. The weather was warm and dry on this particular day, but as the witnesses drove to the location, a severe thunderstorm ensued, which lasted for nearly all of the 40-minute journey. As they arrived, the storm moved away. A stroll round the churchyard showed that there was no one else in the vicinity, the church being located at the end of a long track in the middle of the Cheshire countryside. It is in the middle of nowhere. S had a portable cassette recorder, as there had been reports of music and singing being heard from within the empty church. H showed some signs of boredom, so S suggested that she should see how fast she could run around the church and the churchyard. She ran to the end of the graveyard, a distance of about 50 metres, and back, and returned full of energy and chatty. S and D had at this point moved to the corner of the church nearest the door. In order to tire H out further, S suggested to her that she should see how fast she could run around the church. She set off running in a clockwise direction, and within 10 metres had rounded the first corner and disappeared out of sight. S and D turned around to await her return around the diagonally opposite corner of the church, but as they turned, they immediately saw H coming round the corner. This immediately struck them as an impossible feat, and if you look at the photos, you can't quite get a grasp of the distance, but it is a fair distance to run round the church because there's the original church and an extension on it. H was asked if she'd gone the whole way round the church, and she answered that yes, she had. She was asked to run round again, which she did, and this time the circumnavigation took 40 to 50 seconds. The route was paced out, and from the first corner where she went out of sight to the third corner where she came back into view was a distance of 80 to 100 metres. It was assumed that the witnesses had temporarily lost track of time, and the matter was presumed to be explained. All 3 witnesses then placed a cassette recorder in the doorway of the church and switched it on. All 3 then went to sit on the bench on the side of the church underneath the main church bell. S lit a cigarette whilst they moved position. As they reached the bench, it started to rain, and fearing for the exposed tape recorder, S returned to the doorway and threw away his cigarette as he picked up the cassette recorder. He then ejected the cassette, and as the rain increased, the trip was abandoned and all witnesses returned to the safety of the car. On returning to the car, D asked if he could hear the tape, in case anything had been picked up on it, specifically any EVPs. It was thought that as the tape had only run for a couple of minutes, this was unlikely, but the tape was placed back into the cassette recorder and played. On the playback could clearly be heard the 3 witnesses talking and mentioning that they should go and sit on the bench, and then the sounds of them walking away and growing quieter. After a couple of minutes, the tape didn't seem to have recorded their return. So the tape was fast forwarded to listen for the sounds of their return. When this point was reached on the tape was played and you can hear the sounds of the witnesses very clearly returning. Approximately half the tape appeared to have been used. So it was assumed first that rather than a C60 tape, a C30 had been used, despite the label clearly stating it was a C60. The tape was checked once the witnesses had got home, and the total recording duration from the start, as it was switched on in the church doorway, until the witnesses returned and it was switched off, was actually 14 minutes and 12 seconds. The middle part of the tape, containing the anomalous section, consists of approximately 11 minutes of quiet sounds, including occasional bird song, the wind blowing the leaves in the trees, and other non-specific quiet sounds, quite in keeping with what would be expected from a recording in that location. The machine and the tape were both checked for malfunctioning, and it appeared that the equipment and the cassette itself both functioned properly. Other tests and test recordings made the following day with the same machine further demonstrated the unlikelihood of some malfunction. So we seemingly had 2 time anomalies within a 30-minute period. One was entirely subjective and was only noticed as being unusual in any way by 2 out of the 3 present. The tape incident was confirmed by all 3 persons as to being unusual as the duration of the tape recording severely mismatched our perception of the time the event took in reality. So this event showed no apparent anomaly in the scene presented, although the church has been present at the location since approximately 1150 and is one of the oldest ecclesiastical buildings in Cheshire set in the middle of farmland. So the scenery will not necessarily have changed too much over the years. The event strikes me as being something that may occur more frequently than is realised, as I myself can think of many an occasion when something slightly unusual has occurred, and normally these events are put down to something mundane, such as not paying attention or misperceiving something. Even the testimony of 2 witnesses would not necessarily be enough to make anything of this case, but the coincidental tape recording that also appeared to show an anomaly, that gives this case far more weight. So, perhaps as one cannot describe a typical haunting case, as there appear to be many different flavours of ghost, maybe you also can't describe a typical time slip case. Some may indeed be due to hallucination, but how do we account for the case of the apparent missing time? There have been many theories posited to answer the question of how time slips occur. However, on investigation, they don't actually have much substance. Even explanations that inevitably bring quantum theory into play rely on theories that are simply still that, theories, and moreover are theories at a quantum level, never mind at a macro level. When we first became aware of the cluster of time slip reports from Liverpool, we suspected that the presence of the Underground Railway may have some effect in triggering the experiences, as all the cases appeared to happen within the loop of the railway. But how does this account for cases that happen elsewhere? All the explanations inevitably end in the invocation of unproven and as yet untestable hypotheses. For the future, I'm hopeful that the current proliferation of CCTV cameras may have at least one benefit. If someone reports a time slip and we can obtain the CCTV footage, we may at least be able to answer the question of what physically happens to the witnesses during one of these time slips. So if anyone does have a time slip experience, please report it to me as soon as possible so I can go and try and find the CCTV footage, because I'm absolutely fascinated to find out more about these cases. Now, that is really only a quick flavour of the cases that we've come across, but I hope you agree it's a fascinating phenomenon and one that I really want to know more about. Thank you very much.
And that is absolutely a fascinating subject to get your teeth into. We've got some excellent questions from our guests. Are you able just to stop sharing the screen and then we can see some of the guests? That's great, thank you. Okay, so I've got a question first. And I'm sure you've already thought about this, but is there any correlation between the locations in Liverpool and any other sort of paranormal or anomalous activity taking place? Are you aware of any other things taking place? It's very
hard to tell because it's a big city and big cities are stuffed with ghost reports. So if the events were happening somewhere quieter, it might give us a bit more of a chance to look at it. But everywhere you turn in Liverpool, there's reports of ghosts and strange phenomena and unusual happenings. So it's hard to tie down. The thing that does impress me, even though there are reports from different areas of the town, is the sheer volume of reports from Bold Street and that particular area at the bottom end of Bold Street by the old Lyceum.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's an area that I've not visited Liverpool for many years, but certainly next time I pop into Liverpool, I think I'm going to spend a bit of time around the Bold Street area just to see whether, just to experience what's, going on there. It's absolutely fascinating. And I was particularly fascinated by your case 8, where the guy is walking to the handbag shop or the haberdashery, and as he gets to the shop, the girl has seen the same thing. It's that they're two independent people, aren't they? It's absolutely fascinating.
We've had another one that I've yet to try and work out what happened from that exact same building, what was Waterstones, where a chap was walking into Waterstones and he saw himself walking out of Waterstones at the same time.
Wow. A doppelganger.
Yep.
Amazing. Okay. I've got some questions from our guests, so I'll just read out some of those. So let's have a look at the first one. So this one's from Ian Rowley. Are you aware of any instances of time slips into the future on Bold Street?
Not on Bold Street. There are some reports across the country of time slips into the future. They tend to be most often reported by pilots, weirdly, who are flying over airfields, and it's all shiny and different. I've not had any reported to me from Bold Street, though.
Yeah, I guess that might correlate to another theory about UFOs being from the future as opposed to people travelling through, the universe. But
there is the unusual one of the guy who said there was a coffee shop there when there wasn't, and there is a coffee shop there now, but it's hard to unpick that one because he also said the people seem to be from the past, so I don't know.
Okay, and another one from James Padmore then. What proportion of data comprises individual experiences as opposed to 2 or more witnesses? Have you had a chance to look at that? And has this given you a view of what might be happening?
The majority tend to be single witnesses. The ones with multiple witnesses are rarer, but obviously they're more interesting because you have got multiple witnesses. Although it's interesting, even when you've got single witnesses, if they're meeting another person or alongside another person who doesn't see what they're seeing, that adds another layer to, well, what's going on here? Yeah,
definitely. Are there any reports of alleged time slips getting more recent? Are people still witnessing scenes from further in the past?
Yes, people are still reporting time slips. Now, one of the problems I've got, I did a survey years ago. I was trying to replicate the census of hallucinations, and I got lots of people's ghost reports, and it became very obvious from that people are very, very bad at distinguishing periods of history. So anyone who's wearing anything black that looks a bit flowing is a monk, and anyone who's wearing anything black and a bit long is a Victorian. So it's a bit difficult to try and unpick some of these because people all say, I saw King Charles, or I saw a Victorian, or I saw a monk, and actually what they saw might not be what they're describing. So it's very difficult to pin these down.
Yeah, and it's all, because of the nature of these incidents, is all you've got really to go on is the witnesses, isn't it? And yes. What they can remember and what they perceived has taken place. And certainly living in Bristol, we get lots of reports of monks, but the place was littered with monasteries. And if you see somebody in you don't get a good look at somebody and they've got sort of a long flowing garment on, everybody assumes it's a monk. So it's that misperception taking place, perhaps.
It's also
part of it, maybe.
It's become harder in recent years as well because Liverpool's become quite popular as a filming destination. So it's very hard to walk round a corner and not stumble onto a film set where they're filming some period drama. So that adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, that's quite surreal. And some of the people thinking that actually they might be in a film set and then realising that perhaps they're not in a film set is just, it's quite a fascinating
I always
experience.
say in Chester, because obviously Chester's well known for its Roman centurion ghosts, but we also have a whole load of tour guides who walk around dressed like Roman centurions. So how do you know if you've seen a tour guide or a ghost? It could be
Absolutely.
either.
So CJ's got a question for you. CJ, do you want to